There is a river in southeastern North Carolina that runs black. Not polluted, not poisoned. Naturally dark, tea-colored water stained by the tannins of cypress leaves and tupelo bark, seeping up from the floor of a swamp that has been alive longer than any civilization on this continent. The Lumbee River. 115 miles of slow current winding through bottomland forest, past tobacco fields and tin-roofed farmhouses, under highway bridges where the water below looks like it is holding something it will never give back. The only blackwater river in North Carolina designated as both a national and state wild and scenic river. Cypress knees breaking the surface. Tupelo trees standing in water so dark it reflects the canopy like polished stone. For at least 14,000 years, people have lived along this river. 14,000. That number should stop you. It stopped me. Before Egypt, before Sumer, before the first grain of wheat was cultivated anywhere on Earth. People fished these dark channels, hunted the ridgelines above the swamp, and buried their dead in the sandy soil of Robeson County, North Carolina. Archaeologists have recorded over 400 sites along the river and its tributaries, stone tools, pottery, village remnants stretching back to the Paleo-Indian period and forward through every named era of pre-contact North America. Every one, without a gap. This land was never empty. And the descendants of those people, the ones who are still there, still farming, still fishing that same black water, still gathering at churches along the same dirt roads their grandparents drove. They spent the last 137 years being told they did not exist. Not as people. As a tribe. As something the government would look at and say, yes, you are who you say you are. Their name is Lumbee. They are the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi River. More than 55,000 people. And what DNA revealed about them is not what anyone expected. To understand the Lumbee, you have to understand the place first. Robeson County sits in the flat coastal plain just above the South Carolina line. Drive through it today, and you will see soybean fields stretching to the tree line, churches at every crossroads, a few shuttered factories along Interstate 95, the remnants of a manufacturing economy that left when the trade agreements arrived in the 90s. It does not look remarkable. But look at the demographics and something unusual appears. There is no racial majority in Robeson County. Roughly 38% American Indian, 25% white, 23% black, 10% Hispanic. 4 communities living on top of one another in one of the poorest counties in the state, consistently ranked among the poorest in North Carolina, with nearly a third of residents living below the poverty line. And that has been true, in one form or another, for 300 years. The story the outsiders told about the Lumbee was always a story about not fitting. They spoke English, not an indigenous language. They farmed and dressed like their white and black neighbors. They had no reservation, no treaty with the federal government, no single ancestor tribe that anyone could point to on a map and say, there, that is where they came from. They had no feathered headdresses, no typees, no buffalo hunts. They did not match the image of what America expected a Native American to look like. And in the eyes of the bureaucrats, the ethnographers, the politicians who needed people to fit into boxes, the Lumbee were a problem. Too Indian for the white category. Too English-speaking for the Indian category. Too proudly neither for the colored category that the Jim Crow South tried to force on everyone who was not white. So they fought. Not eventually. Immediately. Not politely. Fiercely. The fight was never a phase. It was their identity. In 1885, North Carolina recognized them, first as the Croatoan Indians, a name that tied them to one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. And to understand why that name mattered so much, you have to go back 300 years before that, to a small island off the Carolina coast where something happened that has never been explained. In 1587, 118 English settlers, men, women, and children, including a baby named Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, landed on Roanoke Island. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies. He expected to return within months, but war with Spain delayed him. 3 years passed before he could cross the Atlantic again. When he finally reached Roanoke in 1590, every single person was gone. The houses had been taken down, not burned. The settlement was dismantled, not destroyed. No bones, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle. The only clues were 3 letters, C-R-O, carved into a tree, and the full word Croatoan carved into a wooden post. Croatoan was the name of a neighboring island, the name of a neighboring tribe, and White had arranged with the colonists that if they moved, they would carve their destination. If they left under duress, they would add a Maltese cross. There was no cross. For more than 4 centuries, people have wondered what happened to those colonists. Theories range from massacre to starvation to absorption. But one theory persisted above the others, that the settlers walked inland, married into the indigenous communities along the rivers, and disappeared not through death, but through love, through blending, through becoming someone new. The people who would become the Lumbee carried many of the same surnames as those vanished settlers: Dial, Hyatt, Taylor, Sampson. They could read and write English when the first European settlers encountered them in the 1700s, a startling thing for a supposedly isolated indigenous community. Some had gray eyes and light hair, features that stopped the colonists in their tracks. Early explorers reported meeting Native Americans in the swamps of the Carolina interior who spoke English and lived in European-style houses. And when Hamilton McMillan, a state legislator, proposed in 1888 that the Indians of Robeson County were the descendants of the lost colony merged with the Croatoan people, the theory became their lifeline. It gave them a name, Croatoan Indians. It gave them separate schools, funded by the state. It gave them a category that was not colored. In a world that was dividing itself ruthlessly into black and white, the lost colony theory gave them a third door, but it also gave outsiders a story to argue about. Forever. By the early 1900s, Crow had become a racial slur in Robeson County. White neighbors used it to mock the very identity that had been given to protect them. The name that was supposed to be a shield became a weapon turned against them. Over the next 70 years, the Lumbee were renamed 7 times. Croatoan Indians in 1885. Indians of Robeson County in 1911. Cherokee Indians of Robeson County in 1913. A claim that was geographically wrong, since the Cherokee had historically lived in the mountains of western North Carolina, hundreds of miles away. And finally, in 1953, Lumbee, named not for any ancestor tribe, but for the dark river that had been their home since before anyone was keeping records. The name was not imposed. It was chosen. In 1952, a Lumbee leader named Reverend D.F. Lowry organized a community referendum, and the people voted overwhelmingly to name themselves after the river. Not after a colonial theory, not after a distant tribe, after the water that ran through their land. Each name change was not confusion. It was negotiation. It was a community trying to explain itself in a language that did not have a word for what they were. Because the truth was more complicated than any single origin story could hold. The Lumbee were not one tribe that survived. They were many tribes that survived, together. When European diseases swept the Carolina coast in the 1600s and 1700s, they killed roughly 95% of the indigenous population. 95%. That is not a decline. That is an extinction event. The Cheraw, the Saponi, the Hatteras, the Waccamaw, the Cape Fear, the Kayawi, tribe after tribe, was reduced to handfuls of survivors scattered across a landscape that had become a graveyard of nations. Entire languages vanished. Entire cosmologies were lost. Entire lineages ended in a single generation of fever and bleeding. And those survivors did what survivors do. They moved. They found each other. They gathered in the one place nobody else wanted. the dense bottomland swamps along the Lumbee River. Cypress and tupelo forest so thick the canopy blocked out the sky. Channels of dark water threading through the floodplain, bearing names like Raft Swamp, Saddle Tree Swamp, Burnt Swamp. Country that was hard to reach and harder to leave. Country where the water itself seemed to say, "You are hidden here." And in that country, over generations, those fragments of shattered peoples married each other. They married settlers who had wandered away from the coast, Scots and English who had fallen through the cracks of colonial society. They married people who had escaped slavery and followed the rivers south into the swamp. And slowly, persistently, across a century of intermarriage and shared hardship and shared worship and shared land, they built something entirely new. Not a tribe that had always existed, a tribe that chose to exist. That distinction matters. It matters more than anything else in this story. But it would not be understood, not truly, not by outsiders, for another 200 years. When commercial DNA testing arrived in the 2000s, a lot of people thought the question of Lumbee identity would finally be settled. The technology felt like justice. Spit in a tube, send it to a lab. The percentages would tell you who was really Indian and who was not. Simple, clean, scientific. The kind of answer that bureaucrats and skeptics had been demanding for over a century. The results were devastating to some, deeply confusing to others, and weaponized almost immediately by people who had never set foot in Robeson County and had no stake in the outcome other than wanting to be right. Some Lumbee families showed significant European ancestry, 60, 70, 80%. Some showed African ancestry. Some showed measurable Native American markers, 8% here, 12% there. And some showed almost none at all. The proportions varied wildly from household to household, from cousin to cousin, in ways that no neat story about a single tribal origin could explain. One person might register 12% Native American on a test from one company and 3% on a test from another. The numbers were not consistent even within the same individual. Outsiders seized on this like evidence of a crime. The critics who had always doubted the Lumbee, and there were many, including some other tribes who had their own reasons for opposing Lumbee recognition, pointed to the results and said, "See, they are not really Indian. The DNA proves it." But that conclusion missed the point so badly that it is almost hard to know where to begin. Because here is what those DNA tests were actually measuring. They were comparing Lumbee genetic profiles against reference databases built overwhelmingly from surviving indigenous populations of the western half of the continent. Navajo, Apache, Ojibwe. Populations that had been large enough and isolated enough and, crucially, survived in sufficient numbers to produce distinctive genetic signatures that testing companies could recognize and catalog. The Lumbee's actual ancestral tribes, the Cherokee, the Saponi, the Tuscarora remnants, the Hatteras, the Cape Fear people, were destroyed so thoroughly by disease, war, and displacement that there are few, if any, full-blooded descendants left alive anywhere. There is no genetic baseline for them in any database. The reference sample does not exist. Think about what that means for a moment. The tests were looking for a signal from people who had been nearly erased from the biological record. And when the test could not find that signal, it did not say, "We cannot tell." It said, "Not detected." Two very different things. One is honest about its limits. The other sounds like a verdict. Imagine a Lumbee grandmother who has lived her entire life in Pembroke, who grew up in Indian schools, who married a Lumbee man, who buried her parents in a Lumbee cemetery alongside headstones going back 200 years, opening an envelope from a testing company and reading that she has no detectable Native American ancestry. What does that do to a person? What does it do to a family? And what does it mean when the test itself is blind to the very people it is supposed to find? It is like trying to identify a language by comparing it to a dictionary that does not contain its alphabet. The failure is in the tool, not in the speaker. The DNA did not prove the Lumbee were not Native American. It proved that the destruction of eastern woodlands tribes was so complete, so catastrophic, that the genetic evidence had been scattered beyond what a consumer test kit could reassemble. And it proved something else, something that matters far more than percentages. Melinda Maynor. Lowry grew up in Robeson County, a Lumbee whose family has lived there for more than 10 generations. She went to Harvard, then UNC Chapel Hill, then to Emory University, where she became one of the most important historians of indigenous identity in the American South. And she put the Lumbee story in terms that changed how I think about identity entirely. The Lumbee, she argued, were never a single surviving tribe. They were a new people, created from the wreckage. Chiraw and Saponi and Hatteras and Tuscarora fragments found each other in the swamps and decided to become one community. Escaped enslaved people joined them. European settlers who had fallen through the cracks of colonial society joined them. And over generations, across centuries, they developed their own kinship networks, their own churches, their own food traditions, their own music. A style of gospel singing so distinctive it has been studied by musicologists, and their own fierce, unmistakable sense of belonging to each other and to this particular stretch of dark water. This was not assimilation. This was not accidental mixing. This was creation, and the DNA proved it. Not by showing a clean, recognizable signal from one ancient tribe, but by showing the beautiful, complicated, unmistakable fingerprint of what happens when human beings from different backgrounds find each other in a place of refuge and say, "We are one people now." The European markers, the African markers, the scattered indigenous signals, those are not evidence of inauthenticity. They are the receipt of a radical act of community building that took place over 200 years in the swamps of the Carolina coastal plain. That is what moved me about this story. Not the controversy over percentages, not the academic arguments about haplogroups and reference databases. The quiet, radical fact that a community was forged, that belonging was a choice, made over and over, parent to child, generation after generation, in the face of a world that kept insisting they pick a box or disappear. They chose each other, and they never stopped choosing. If you have been moved by stories like this, stories where what looks like a controversy turns out to be something far more human, consider subscribing to this channel. We keep coming back to the question of what makes a people. Now, you need to understand what that refusal to be boxed actually cost them, what it took to keep choosing each other in a country that demanded you choose a side. In 1835, North Carolina's Constitution was revised to strip voting rights and the right to bear arms from all free persons of color. The Lumbee were swept into that category. Overnight, a people who had owned land, voted, and farmed for generations were reduced to a legal status barely distinguishable from the enslaved. They could not serve on juries. They could not testify against white people in court. They could not carry weapons. During the Civil War, Confederate authorities conscripted Lumbee men to build fortifications at Fort Fisher near Wilmington and dig in salt mines. The work was brutal. The conditions were killing. Young men fled into the swamps to avoid it. Lying out, they called it, hiding in the same dark water that had sheltered their ancestors for generations. Among them was a teenager named Henry Berry Lowry. Born around 1845 to Alan and Mary Cumbo Lowry on a 350-acre farm in the Hopewell community, Henry was one of 12 children. His family was Methodist, landowning, established. His father's farm was one of the most successful in the county. That should have been enough to protect them. It was not. In February 1865, the Confederate Home Guard raided the Lowry farm and found hidden guns and goods, supplies that the family had been gathering to help those lying out in the swamps. Alan Lowry, Henry's father, and William, his brother, were seized. They were marched away from the house, and they were executed in front of the family. No trial, no hearing, just 2 shots. Henry Berry Lowry was 19 years old. What followed was 7 years of fire. He assembled a band, Lumbee cousins, 2 freedmen, 1 poor white Scot, and waged a guerrilla war across Robeson County. They robbed the plantation class and gave the money to the poor. They targeted the men who had been involved in his father's execution. The governor declared Lowry an outlaw and placed a $12,000 bounty on his head, a staggering sum, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands today. Federal troops were deployed. Artillery was brought to Lumberton. Hundreds of soldiers hunted him through the swamps he had known since childhood. They never caught him. He was captured 3 times and escaped each time. Once, by filing through his cell bars with a file smuggled to him by his gang on the night of his own wedding, with hundreds of guests waiting outside. Another time, he simply walked out of a courthouse. A New York Herald correspondent who tracked him down called him one of those remarkable executive spirits that arises now and then in a raw community without advantages other than those given by nature. When the authorities held the wives of his band hostage in prison, Lowry sent a letter. "Release them, or the bloodiest times will be here that ever was before." The wives were released immediately. The colonel knew Lowry meant it. In February 1872, after robbing $28,000 from the sheriff's safe, Henry Berry Lowry walked into the swamp and vanished. His body was never found. The bounty was never collected. His brother, a minister, announced at a Republican convention that Henry was dead. But his wife, Rhoda, insisted until the day she died, in 1909, 37 years later, that he had escaped. Some Lumbee claimed they saw him at a funeral years afterward. Others said he lived out his days in another state under a different name. His most famous words: "We mean to live as long as we can, and if we die, to die game." That spirit did not die with him. During Jim Crow, Robeson County developed something that existed almost nowhere else in the American South. 3 sets of water fountains, 3 sets of restrooms, 3 separate school systems, 3 sections in every movie theater: white, black, Indian. The county built a form of segregation so specific to its own population that it had to invent its own architecture of division. At one point, Robeson had 6 separate and unequal school systems running simultaneously. The Lumbee fought for those separate Indian schools, and this is crucial to understand, not because they wanted segregation, but because they refused to be classified as colored. Being pushed into black schools would have meant accepting the erasure of who they were. It would have meant the government had succeeded in turning them into something they were not. So they built their own. They established a normal school for training Indian teachers in 1887, scraping together funding in a community where poverty was the rule, not the exception. That school grew over the decades. It became Pembroke State College for Indians. It is now the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, a university that exists because a people refused to disappear. And in January 1958, when the Ku Klux Klan drove through Robeson County with a loudspeaker truck, announcing a rally near the town of Maxton, when a Klan leader from South Carolina who called himself Catfish, Cole said he intended to put 30,000 half-breeds in their place. When crosses were burned on the lawns of 2 Lumbee families in the nights before, the Lumbee did not call the police. They bought every round of ammunition in the local hardware store. On the night of January 18th, roughly 50 Klansmen gathered in a field of dried broom straw near Hayes Pond. A cold winter night. A single light bulb powered by a car battery hung from a pole, casting a dim arc over the field. They did not realize they were surrounded. 500 Lumbee men, some estimates say 1,000, many of them armed, some carrying shotguns, some carrying rifles, closed in from the tree line and encircled the field. When the rally began, a Lumbee man walked up to Cole and started arguing. The tension snapped like a wire. A shotgun blast shattered the light bulb. Darkness, then gunfire into the air. War cries, the sound of hundreds of people advancing through the dry broom straw. The Klansmen broke and ran into the woods. Cole hid in a swamp, the very kind of swamp the Lumbee had been hiding in for centuries. His wife's car got stuck in a ditch and had to be pushed out by the very people he had come to terrorize. The abandoned KKK banner was carried back to Pembroke, where Simeon Oxendine, a World War II veteran, wrapped himself in it and grinned for the cameras. Life magazine ran the photograph. It went around the world. Letters of support flooded into Robeson County from across America. The Klan never held another rally in Robeson County. Not once. Not ever. And still, after the guerrilla war, after routing the Klan with their bare hands and borrowed shotguns, after building their own schools, their own churches, their own university, after 137 years of petitions and hearings and bills that passed the House of Representatives 9 separate times and died in the Senate 9 separate times, the Lumbee were told they were not Indian enough for the federal government. The Lumbee Act of 1956 was one of the most uniquely cruel pieces of legislation in the history of federal Indian law. It said, in plain language, the Indians now residing in Robeson and adjoining counties are hereby recognized as a tribe of Indians. And then, in the very next sentence, nothing in this act shall make such Indians eligible for any services, benefits, or privileges provided by the United States to Indians because of their status as Indians. Read those 2 sentences again. They recognized the Lumbee as Indians and, in the same breath, said that recognition would mean nothing. No health care, no education funding, no housing assistance, no disaster relief. Nothing. Recognition without rights. An acknowledgement that was also an erasure. A handshake delivered with a closed fist. That law stood for 69 years. Through the civil rights movement, through the self-determination era, through 9 separate attempts to fix it. For 69 years, the largest tribe east of the Mississippi was told, "You are real, but we will not help you." In 1993, a Lumbee teenager named Adrian Lowry had the chance to ask President Bill Clinton a question. He asked about his tribe's status. He was a child, standing in front of the most powerful person in the world, asking why his people did not count. That child grew up. He was still waiting 32 years later. Until December 18, 2025. When the Lumbee Fairness Act was signed into law, tucked into a defense spending bill 3,000 pages deep, making the Lumbee the 575th federally recognized tribe in the nation. Dozens of Lumbee watched from the Senate gallery as the vote passed 77-20. Back in Pembroke, at the tribal headquarters, people who had never met each other embraced and wept. The chairman of the tribe, John Lowry, said through tears, "I want to thank our ancestors." His voice breaking on the word ancestors. 137 years. Think about that number. That is longer than most nations have existed on this continent. Babies were born, grew old, and died during the span of that fight. Entire generations lived their whole lives being told, "We see you, but we will not help you." And still they kept going. 137 years is not stubbornness. It is something closer to faith. Here is what I keep coming back to. The DNA tests were supposed to answer the question, who are the Lumbee really? And the answer was, they are everyone. They are the Cheraw woman who walked south when her village died, the Tuscarora man who refused to leave Carolina, the English farmer who wandered away from the coast and never came back, the enslaved man who disappeared into the swamp and found people who would take him in. The Saponi child who was the last of her line until she was not, until she married and had children, and her line continued inside something new. They are all of those people, and they are none of them alone, because they became something that did not exist before they made it. A people forged from catastrophe, bound not by a single bloodline, but by a choice repeated so many times, across so many generations, that it became indistinguishable from blood. The river still runs through Robeson County, 115 miles of dark water, cypress knees breaking the surface, the slow pull of current beneath the tannin stain. From a distance it looks black. Up close, it is the color of tea. The Lumbee have another name, older than any government record, older than any DNA test, older than any act of Congress. People of the dark water. The water is dark because of what the land gives to it. Leaves fall, bark dissolves. The forest floor seeps its memory into the current. The river carries everything the land has been. And the people who named themselves for that water understood something that a DNA test will never capture. You do not need to come from one place, one line, one unbroken story, to belong somewhere so deeply that the belonging becomes the story itself. 14,000 years of footprints along one river, 7 names, one people. Still here.